better off just talking. Thank you. I hate microphones. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Really. Just want to go over a couple ground rules. But before I want to thank the Jackson Hole Jewish community and the board for bringing Jonathan to us. I want to thank the sponsors, Melody Nussdorf, Steve Meltzer, where are you? If you want to raise your hand, Beryl Weiner, and the Sobans brought Jonathan here. Couple ground rules. This is obviously a contentious issue, so we're going to be polite. If we have difference of opinion, that's fine. Jonathan Conricus is going to talk for a while and then take questions. When you ask your questions, not a statement like I tend to do. So just questions. Let me tell you a little bit about Jonathan. He was born in Jerusalem. His family moved to Malmö, Sweden, where they experienced a lot of anti-Semitism. Came back to Israel around age 13, served in the Israeli Defense Forces, was a combat commander both in Gaza and in Lebanon. But then his life takes an interesting turn. He ends up being seconded to the UN. That means he was the first IDF officer to go to the UN to advise them on peacekeeping forces. And I believe he was there for 3 years. After that, he came back and he served in the IDF in the spokesperson's unit. Many of you may recognize Jonathan because until 2021, he was the international spokesperson for the IDF, at which time he retired, kind of tired, after having to talk to everybody. But then October 7 came. Within days, I saw my friend Jonathan on TV. Because he was a reserve officer coming back, he got the joy of having the late shift, which meant, though, if you were watching TV, any of the broadcast channels, you were seeing him at 5 p.m., 6 p.m., 7, 8 p.m. our time, and he was a tireless warrior. Because what's going on is Israel's facing two wars. One war is the kinetic war, what we think about, soldiers, guns, bullets, and all that. But the other is the information war. And Jonathan is an incredibly tireless warrior in that. He's been in the United States for a couple of weeks. He agreed to come out here, so I'm thrilled to introduce Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus.
Thank you, Cliff, for organizing this, for being an excellent friend of Israel, for being a very good scholar of what's going on, for writing a very good book about Hezbollah, and for bringing me here. So thank you for that. Shalom, everyone. First thing to say, I am very happy to be here. It's an honor. When I have an agreement with my wife since January, when I finished 3 months of reserve duty, I told my wife that now I'll need to travel and engage with Jewish communities around the world and with friends of Israel around the world in order to continue the battle that Cliff speaks about. And we agreed that I'll do no more than 2 weeks at a time. So half of a month I'd be out and half of the month I'd be back home. When Cliff reached out and said, let's bring you to Jackson Hole, I admit I did not know about this magnificent place. And having come here, I understand why you all love it and why you spend your time here. It is magnificent, and I envy you for having so much space, nature, water, and the color green, our favorite yet very rare color in Israel. And I understand why this is such a heaven for people to be here during summer and winter. So I was very happy to be invited, and I stand here today, and important to emphasize that I do not speak on behalf of the IDF anymore. I never spoke on behalf of the Israeli government. Other people did that, but I spoke on behalf of the IDF. So what you'll hear from me are basically my own opinions based on 24 years of service in the IDF, with still a lot of access to IDF information from behind the scenes, And today I'm also a very proud senior fellow at an American think tank called FDD, Foundation for Defense of Democracies, which is a very good place to be, full of very smart people that I benefit from in terms of their brain power and analysis capabilities. So what you'll hear from me today is kind of a mix of those things. I say that to begin with because in the questions and answers, and even before that, I hope you won't be too surprised, but yes, I also have criticism of my own military and government. Not everything is perfect, and I'm not here to say that everything is perfect, and I never claimed that we were perfect. But what you'll hear from me is the truth as I know it and understand it, and I'll be as direct, as tachlis as possible. So, I'd start with bringing us back more than 10 months ago, and you know, I've done many talks in different occasions and had many briefings, and the number one question, there's 1, 2, and 3. Number one, by a margin, is how did it happen? How did the mighty IDF allow this to happen on the 7th of October? And I still don't have complete answers because we haven't looked into it systematically, but based on after-action reviews, based on investigative journalism, based on testimonies that I've heard from survivors and from soldiers, and based on what I knew, what I know as a former Israeli officer and someone who had access to a lot of information before, I'll say that it was probably the biggest misinterpretation of enemy intentions and strategy, and a lack of respect and underestimate of the enemy's capabilities. And there are many more things that go into it, but looking at October 7, I've shared this with a few people. I served for 24 years in the IDF. Never ever was I anything but proud to be in my Israeli uniform. I wore it with the utmost pride. I represented Israel at the UN, with UN peacekeeping forces, with other militaries, and of course in the media. But the only time that I felt different was a week or so after October the 7th, as I was on my way to the IDF spokesperson unit, preparing for my night shift, as Cliff pointed out. By the way, I volunteered for the night shift. I volunteered for it because I remember how tough the job was, having done it for 4 years, and I told my friend, who was the spokesperson at the time, Richard, I told him, listen, this is going to be a long marathon of a war, and if you don't get sleep, you'll make silly mistakes, and you won't do good interviews, and you won't manage well. So what I will do is that you have all of these volunteers that are here, and they're noisy during the day, but then during the night, usually people don't want the night shift. I'll do the night shift. I'll try to clear your desk. And if there are incoming requests for interviews, I'll take care of them. And I didn't know that it would be around 40, at the peak it was 40 interviews per night that I did. And I had colleagues who would do a lot of interviews as well. And then almost the same number of interviews during the day, others did. So it was a massive amount of interviews. But when I went to the night shift one evening, I remember I was in my uniform and I wanted to get some food for my shift at the local supermarket in Tel Aviv. So I went out of the vehicle, went in, and I noticed that people were looking at me. And it wasn't the regular looks that you're used to seeing as an Israeli officer over the years, where people love, support, are proud, and all of those positive things. For the first time, and that really hit it home, I saw in the eyes of my fellow Israelis how angry and disappointed and ashamed and furious and frustrated they were. And it was a very, very powerful and sad moment. I think that everybody in the IDF, reserve and regular duty, will carry the shame of October the 7th for a long time forward, and it will take more than a generation for this to heal. I start with that because lots of people, of course, want to talk about it. And I also want to bring people back to how this all began. This was a war that Israel didn't want, did not start, was forced into, and that we now have to make sure that we win and end it victoriously, but it's definitely not something that Israel had in its mind or was part of Israeli strategy. And if we all could think for a second about the human potential that was lost on October the 7th and since, numbers-wise, it's numbers that are almost now equal to Yom Kippur. We're getting close to Yom Kippur numbers. Yom Kippur, it was a little bit more than 2,200 soldiers that were killed. On October 7th, we had almost 900 civilians killed on the first day and about 300 soldiers, and up until now, we have passed the 1,600 mark of Israelis killed. We have more than 4,800 wounded, some of them very, very severely. I don't know if you here in the crowd have been participating in sending donations or kit and gear and support. I know that many people do, and I'm very grateful for it. One of the things that Israel has been able to do on the battlefield, and this is world-breaking times, world record times, is that today on the battlefield, if an Israeli soldier is wounded, within less than an hour, most cases less than an hour, but around an hour, he is already in a level 3 emergency room getting surgery. And this has saved so many lives because medical services have become so much better. So what in the past used to be killed in action are now wounded, but very severely wounded. And we have an abnormal amount of severely wounded with lots of injuries that will deal with the consequences of that for a long time. But if we look at the human casualties, I think about the potential lost, the children, the elderly, the men, the women, the soldiers who just started their life. And it is a very sad thing to think of. But every once in a while, when I needed, as a spokesperson, to be strengthened, you know, it's a challenging thing to sit in front of basically a lens or a camera, and usually you don't see the person interviewing you, but you sit in front of a camera and you do interview after interview, and it's basically the same questions. Most of the questions are very similar. Most of them are blaming Israel for what happened, except for the first week. And first week it was a lot of gloating against Israel, but after that, when the picture started to change, then it was basically the same set of questions about Palestinian civilians and casualties and all of that charade. And every once in a while I had to remind myself why we're fighting, who we're fighting against, and I even forced myself to listen to stories of survivors from the Nova Music Festival, from the kibbutzim, what they encountered themselves, and also to look at Hamas videos that they themselves broadcast to remind myself what kind of monsters we're fighting, and then to strengthen my core when difficult and repeated questions came. And thankfully that worked, more or less. Today Israel is fighting a war on 7 fronts. It is not a war, it's not one war, it's multiple battles or multiple small wars being fought simultaneously. The theater of operations in Gaza is still the main one. That's how it's defined by the Israeli government and by the military. But I think that will soon shift towards Lebanon. It's a matter of time before that happens. And we'll see when and if that happens. But these are two most important, the very burning fronts. By the way, 3.5 months ago, in the horrible statistics of the war, we passed the threshold moment of more rockets having been fired at Israel from the north than from the south, and more alarms triggered by rockets fired from Hezbollah than by Hamas in the south. Yet the southern front is still the main one, where most of the troops are deployed. We're fighting Iranian proxies in Syria. They have not been very successful and they haven't done a lot of damage. We are fighting Palestinian organizations and Iranian proxies and a mix of all of those in Judea and Samaria. Some people, for some reason, call it the West Bank, but I prefer to use the biblical and original Hebrew name of that area. And we are fighting about 1,200 miles away from Israel against the Houthis. And for the first time, I think ever, we are now, ever since mid-April, engaged directly with the Iranians. So these are the 7 fronts. Another front can evolve, and it's not spoken about a lot in American media. It's only for those who are really up to speed. And if you ask me where I'm worried about future events happening, of course the knowns, Hezbollah and Iran. But when I look at Jordan, I'm concerned to see a country that is very important for regional stability, very important for Israeli security. It is our longest border, almost 300 miles of border. And let me tell you here, it is not the best defended border that we have, sadly, for budgetary and priority considerations. And the Iranians are hard at work, and they have been hard at work in Jordan in trying to destabilize that regime, the Hashemite kingdom. And what they're also doing is smuggling weapons from southern Syria through northern Jordan into Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank. And if you are asking us, if you would ask yourself, how come there's so many more new terror organizations in Judea and Samaria, and where are they all getting their weapons from? Then the answer is that this is a specific project that Iran has designated about 2 years ago, and they are now at an industrial effort to pump that area full of weapons. And that is something that isn't spoken about a lot, but it's definitely something that can challenge Israeli security and regional stability. What the Iranians are telling the Jordanians so far, and I know this from first-hand conversation with Jordanian officials, is don't worry, we're only in transit. As in, don't worry, we're not going to mess around in your backyard, and you don't need to be threatened. We're not going to destabilize Jordan. We're only after the Jews. And the Jordanians are smart enough to know that once Iranians are in a country, it doesn't end well, and it doesn't end with something that is small and limited to only transit. That's bad in itself, because usually it brings criminal activity. But it is something that is worrying. So if you hear in the future that some big thing happened in Jordan, clashes between Jordanian security forces and Iranians, maybe the Muslim Brotherhood or others, then that's the context of this happening. I think that we are now in actually historic times, and I've never said that before. I usually don't use a lot of fancy words. I try to keep my language plain so I can understand it myself. And I think that we may be in a historic time. Why so? Because for the last 25, 30 years, the Islamic Republic of Iran has had a very well-defined, clear, and actionable strategy that they have stuck to, and they have executed it very well in a very disciplined and thoughtful way. And their strategy has been very simple. They've looked at past wars between Israel and its enemies, and they saw 48, 56, 67, 73, 82, and they understand Israel cannot be defeated on the battlefield, so let's try something else if we want to annihilate the Jewish state, the little Satan. What they did many years ago was to define a strategy of attrition, whereby they build different terror organizations around Israel. Either they build them from scratch, like Hezbollah, and if you want to know more details about Hezbollah, I can really recommend Cliff's book about them. It speaks about their origin, their structure, their weapons, their capabilities. But that's an example of one organization that was built by design by the Iranians in a foreign country, in Lebanon. And then they've also been successful in basically hijacking or piggybacking off other organizations that were founded by other movements, Muslim Brotherhood or others, and then taking them, funding them, providing them with weapons, and bringing them into the fold. That's the story of Hamas. Hamas didn't start out as an Iranian proxy. They started out as an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, and then they evolved into a terror army and a semi-nation state, you could call it. They govern Gaza. And over the years, their ties have grown closer and closer to Iran. But the Iranian strategy has been to encircle Israel in a ring of fire and to keep Israel busy fighting for itself in a war of attrition. You could think of it as death by 1,000 cuts, and to continuously attack Israel and degrade its economic capabilities, its diplomatic capabilities, its military strength, until it is finally weak enough for the final push and then attack. And that's the Iranian strategy. Now, here is something interesting. I'm sure you all know, and I'm sure you watched it with a lot of concern, the months before October 7, Israel was in quite a lot of instability. There were political agendas, and there were protests, and there were quite a lot of things happening on Israeli streets. There were calls to not to serve in the military, and there were all kinds of bad things happening in Israel. I'm not going to go into politics, but from an enemy perspective, perhaps Hamas or the Iranians thought that now Israel is weak enough, and therefore let's go for the attack. That could have been the miscalculation and underestimation that they did of us, just as we misunderstood their strategic intentions and underestimated their real capabilities. That may have been the miscalculation that the Iranians did. Fast forward 10 months, today, I think it's safe to say that Israel is dragging Iran out of the shadows and forcing the Islamic Republic to face Israel out in the open. And it's an area that the Iranians are not very comfortable in. They're unexperienced. This is uncharted territory for the Iranians. They are by far best in the world at puppeteering, at using others. There's the famous cynical saying that the Iranians will fight Israel until the last Arab. And I think that's true. They're happy to send others to die for them. They're not so happy, nobody is, but they're very sensitive to their own getting killed. And today, the Iranians, or a few days ago, a week or so ago, the Iranians said that they're going to strike Israel. And Israel is now bracing for such a strike, a second strike. But when we zoom out for a second, it's actually something that I think can be pivotal in the Middle East. And I am still surprised that the Iranians decided to strike in April and that they are now doing it again. It is a surprise. I'm sure that it will come up, so I'll preempt the question, what will the Iranians do? I think that the Iranians, having the supreme leader himself, Khamenei, when he issued a statement that Iran is going to attack Israel, then of course we cannot assume that it will be anything less than what they tried to do the first time. They tried and failed the first attack. It was a glorious failure. About 99% of everything that they fired towards Israel was successfully intercepted by a coalition of Israeli, American, British, and French assets, air and ground-borne assets, with the active participation and assistance of Jordan and with the indirect assistance of Saudi Arabia. And that's good news. Hasn't happened many times in history, actually never, that an Arab country participates in the defense of Israel. There's always a silver lining. But I don't think that we can look ahead at what's coming from Iran and think that it will be less than 300 and something rockets, missiles, and missiles and drones that will be fired. We should anticipate more. Now, if you ask me, my gut feeling looking at decision making in Iran and thinking about consequences, I think that the Iranians are taking their time also because they are very aware that after they strike, we will retaliate. And they are now thinking of, okay, what do we do? One big question is, will Iran strike civilian facilities? Or will they only aim for military? Last time, they aimed only for air bases and military facilities of strategic importance. And 3 missiles hit in Nevatim, an air base in southern Israel. We fixed the damage to the runway a few hours later, and nothing of real substance happened. Their dilemma now is whether they want to inflict more pain on Israel and if they want to hit civilian targets, knowing very well that if they do, Israel has a long list of dual-use targets in Iran, from ports to infrastructure, governmental buildings, headquarters, etc., ministries, that Israel not only has the capacity to do, but had also shown that to the Iranians, that Israel has the ability to deliver precise munitions inside Iran, despite them having 3 or 4 layers of air defenses on the way. So that's where we are now. If you call friends and family in Israel, some may be saying that they're very worried and that they're terrified and it's a very stressful period, and that we are held hostage by the Iranians, and some are going about their daily lives as before. Kids are going to summer camp, parents are working or juggling in between, people are at the beach, and it's summer vacation in Israel. There's a very big spread, but one thing that I think we can say quite securely is that the Rubicon of direct confrontation between Iran and Israel has been crossed, and that Rubicon of fear is now, I think, less than it was the last time. When I measure what I hear from Israelis now, as opposed to before April, the mid-April strike, it feels a little bit less now. And hopefully that won't be misguided. In Gaza, there was a very odd CNN report today, I don't know if you got to see it, which was based on very odd sources, which claims that only 3 of Hamas's 24 battalions in Gaza have been significantly degraded. I know of a very different picture in Gaza, and I will prove what I say by Hamas's actions. Israel, and I think we can say this quite clearly, Israel assassinated Ismail Haniyeh in the capital of Hamas's patrons, in Tehran. What did Hamas do in return? Does anybody know?
Nothing.
They didn't do very much. They didn't do a lot, and it's not for lack of will, it's for lack of capacity. They fired 6 or 7 rockets towards Kiryat Gat and south of Ashdod, not really south of Ashdod, Yavne. None of them hit anything. Open terrain, one was intercepted and the rest exploded in open terrain. And they didn't even issue a proper, Hamas-style communique with fancy videos and graphics and some Arab speaking broken Hebrew and threatening Israelis. They didn't even do that. They only had some guy holding a handwritten with a Sharpie poster, we're going to get even, and they fired a few rockets. How can that be if not for the reason that they have run out of rockets, they have run out of personnel, their command and control has been disrupted, their logistic capabilities are severely disrupted, and today also their ability to get more weapons in, new weapons in, and spare parts and ammunition has been all but destroyed by Israel by taking the Philadelphia corridor. Now, if you would have asked me before the war how long would it take Israel to do it, I would have said half a year, 5 months, we should be able to go in, overwhelm Hamas, degrade their capabilities, and achieve what we have achieved now. It took us longer than that. Most of the reasons are related to the fact that we were so extremely careful with civilians, and we were forced to stop and start and stop and start in our operations. We were tricked by Hamas into believing that there could be a second hostage deal, and therefore we waited with the attack on Rafah, and then came Ramadan, and then we waited some more, and there's been all kinds of disruptions along the way, but essentially today Militarily speaking, I think that we are very, very close to achieving the first goals that Israel set out to do against Hamas, and that is to defeat their military capabilities and to make sure that they won't be able to govern the Gaza Strip and to pose or to launch an October 7th style attack against Israel again. And that's a good thing. But that's only the first stage. And now comes the much more challenging stage of transitioning from main combat operations into lower intensity, but going from that into shaping the future of Gaza. And while I have many positive things to say about how we conducted operations against Hamas in fighting, I know that other militaries, I know that all of the other Western militaries are looking at what Israel did, learning from it, and are very happy with the experiences that and the new knowledge that the IDF generated. You know, I have a folder on my computer that I'll hopefully start using soon, which is a folder that I started filling in the first 2-3 weeks of the war, and it's all different kinds of experts. Military experts, political experts, academics, think tank guys, etc., who were on American TV, various networks, explaining to us, to Israel, that it cannot be done. That you cannot go into Gaza, it's too difficult of a target, that they're so heavily entrenched, and that it will be a quagmire, it will be a grave for the IDF, and that you'll never be able to defeat a terrorist organization because of the support of the population, etc., etc., etc. And I saved all of those people in a folder, and soon I will start tweeting them out as we wrap things up in Gaza and as we start the second stage. However, having said that and being relatively satisfied with the achievements on the battlefield, it's difficult to use positive words about war, but satisfied with the achievements. What I'm not very satisfied about currently is the political ability, the diplomatic ability of Israel to build a coalition and to present a vision for what we intend for there to be in Gaza. It's okay to take out Hamas, that's absolutely a condition. Nothing good can happen in Gaza before Hamas is out and before UNRWA is out. Those two have to go, otherwise there's no future for Gaza, there's only more despair and poverty and terrorism. But let's say those two are out. What I have not seen yet from Israel is a vision that says, okay, this is what we want to do. And that is worrying because, from a personal perspective, I have 4 kids. My youngest is 11. And I've had discussions with my wife where we talked about this, and we agree that it's very likely that also in 6 years, when our youngest son will join the military, and he will do so as a proud Israeli patriot, it's very feasible to think that he also will be deployed in Gaza. And I, as an Israeli civilian, would want for there to be a plan, a vision, and something that will de-escalate the area from the horrible situation that it is in now to de-radicalize it, and to start actually defeating Hamas, but defeating it in a long-term way. And that still hasn't really materialized. I hope that the government is busy planning and working with regional and international allies in order to get that done. The tougher military situation is up north. If I can say with relative confidence that we have more or less contained Hamas and that we have degraded their strategic capabilities to such an extent that there is no significant threat to Israelis in the south, that is not something, unfortunately, that I can say about Hezbollah and the situation up north. And up north, the stakes are much, much higher. Now everybody in the world will talking about Iran and Israel and retaliation, etc. But the first order of business is Hezbollah. And if we compare Hamas and Hezbollah, there are many differences. But first and foremost, Hezbollah is about 5 times more powerful than what Hamas was in its peak before October 7. And that's across the board. The amount of rockets that they have, the size of their rockets, their accuracy. Hamas only has what we call stupid rockets or statistic rockets that you can aim once, direction and angle, and that determines where it will fly. Sometimes it misses, many times it misses, sometimes it hits the target, and it can be easily intercepted. Hezbollah has many more of those, about 5 times more than what Hamas had, and they also have nation-state capabilities like European countries and militaries have, which is precision-guided missiles. For those of you who don't deal in the differences between rockets and missiles, what's the difference? The difference is that a rocket is statistic, can hit and miss, and you can aim it in a general direction and you can't control it in flight. A missile, a precision-guided missile, usually hits within less than 50 yards. That's the lowest capability of a missile, and you can control it in flight, and it is many, many more times accurate, and its reliability is much higher. And Hezbollah has been very clear about what they intend to do with these rockets. They intend to fire them at our strategic infrastructure, at our electricity, at the gas rig, at our ports, at our airport and our air bases, and that is what they will be using these missiles for. And I believe Hezbollah. I believe that that is what they intend to do, and I don't think that they're making an empty threat. What they also have, Hezbollah, is many more and better trained personnel with better weapons when you compare them to Hamas. And contrary to the situation in Gaza, where Israel eventually made it down to Rafah and cut the line of supply, the logistic line of supply of Hamas, the tunnels that were open for business freely from Egypt into Gaza for many, many years. Now they have been severed, almost all of them, and that will impede Hamas's ability to fight now and ever fight in the future. That is not something that we can do with Hezbollah. Hezbollah is in Lebanon, and they get their weapons from Iran, transferred from Iran through Iraq, Syria, and then eventually into Lebanon. We cannot control the Syrian-Lebanese border. There's no way that we can go there and control it like we do with the Gaza-Egyptian border. And as such, that tells you, because wars are won through logistics, not through combat operations, that tells you that that enemy will have a continuous supply of weapons even if we defeat Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. About between 65 and 80,000 Israelis are refugees in their own country. Kids who, before October the 8th, lived in northern Israel, were evacuated, have been studying or attending some kind of educational facility for the last 10 months until summer break. They will now start school in different places, not in their homes. The schools are not going to open in northern Israel, and these 80,000 Israelis and kids among them are going to resettle elsewhere. So sadly, it's as if Israel has shrunk by a piece of about, imagine a strip that is 80 miles wide or 60 miles wide and 5 miles thick. For a country the size of, or for a state the size of Wyoming, that probably isn't much. For Israel, that is a very big deal. Very big deal. And that is what Hezbollah has done. And bottom line is that this war cannot end, will not end, before Israelis are brought back home safely to their homes. Before the Israeli government can say and assure that these people can go back home to the kibbutzim that are virtually on the border with Lebanon, and that they can be there safely without Hezbollah launching an October 7th style attack at them, which, by the way, would be much worse than what Hamas did, because they are more powerful, better organized, and better weapons. So you see the catch-22 situation here. How can it end with Hezbollah? Either through a diplomatic deal, which I do not see in the making. I do not see a diplomatic or international urgency to get it done. I hear talk, I hear statements of concern, but I do not see anybody forcing Hezbollah to the table to implement UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which was adopted in 2006, which states that they're not supposed to be in southern Lebanon. let alone be armed, and let alone be firing rockets at Israel. But nobody's doing that. And I don't think that Hezbollah will agree to such a thing without being incentivized to do so. And the only incentive that I can think that will bring Hezbollah to step back and sign some kind of temporary ceasefire will be Israel forcing them to. And that is a scenario which is not an easy one to think about, for the reasons that I've said before. Just to put things into perspective, numbers-wise, there have been about 18,000 rockets fired at Israel from Gaza and Lebanon since October 7. 18,000. Most of them, the ones that were going to impact, were intercepted. And generally speaking, I think that Israeli air defenses have performed quite brilliantly. And the amount of Israeli casualties from rockets have been very, very few. Our casualties were from October the 7th, point-blank executions and burning and beheadings. They were not so much from, at all from rockets. However, just to put things into perspective, Hezbollah, if they go all out in terms of rocket fire, the Israeli assessment is that they could fire 4,500 rockets every day at Israel, covering all of populated Israel, so south of Tel Aviv, Ashdod. I'm sure you remember the Israeli map well enough, but 60 and 70 miles from Lebanon. And they would be able to sustain that fire for at least a week, maybe two. Now, when you do the math of how many casualties that would be in Israel, that would be a significant amount of casualties, because our air defenses will be prioritizing our national infrastructure, our electric grid, our gas rigs, our ports, our airports, and all of the most important infrastructure. What that means is that Israeli civilians will have their bomb shelter as the only thing protecting them from incoming rockets. Now, if we take that one step further, and here this becomes very relevant to you, we know how the story goes. They'll be firing rockets at us. We will have, sadly, casualties. We will be retaliating against them. And the casualty rate in Lebanon will be far, far higher. Why so? Because Hezbollah fires their rockets just like Hamas does in Gaza. They fire their rockets from within residential areas, hiding behind buildings, or firing them from within buildings. And they store all of their weapons within the populated areas. There's only a very few locations in northeastern Lebanon where Hezbollah has proper military facilities that are only military. And rest assured that those will be dealt with very quickly. But the others are, all of them, they're nested within Shiite population in Lebanon, in Beirut and in southern Lebanon. Now you can imagine 200 casualties in Israel every day. Imagine the pressure on the Israeli government and on the IDF to suppress enemy fire and to make sure that the fire at Israelis stop. If Israel has access to lots and lots of JDAMs, of guided munitions and missiles that are made and delivered by the US, then that is what Israel will use. And then we will be able to strike very accurately where the rockets are being fired from, and hopefully strike them very well. If Israel doesn't have access to it, then what that will mean is that Israel will use whatever we have at hand. We still have lots of stockpiles of big artillery rounds, and we have lots of rockets that can be, or bombs that can be dropped from planes that are not GPS guided, so-called stupid bombs or unguided bombs. If that is what Israel will have, that is what Israel will use. And then you can think and imagine what the situation will be in Lebanon and the amount of destruction and devastation and casualties. It will be very, very ugly, far worse than the Second Lebanon War, far worse than what you're seeing now, even in the most skewed BBC or Al Jazeera report from Gaza. It'll be much worse than that in Lebanon. And I think that's something that we want to avoid. Israel has been trying to avoid that for the last 10 months, basically containing enemy attacks and trying to find diplomatic solutions before going to the military alternative. But sadly, there don't seem to be a lot of other alternatives, and eventually Israelis will have to go back to their homes. And eventually Israel will have to provide the security to facilitate it. It's a very basic equation. So those are the two most active fronts. We spoke about Gaza, we spoke about Lebanon, we addressed Iran, we addressed how possibly historic this week or these weeks are, where maybe for the first time Israel will indicate that it has changed its strategy towards Iran. And if I haven't been pessimistic enough in what I've said so far, I'll say something that is half pessimistic, but you can also understand it in a positive way. I think that Israel will not enjoy security and stability and peace as we desire and as we want, as long as we don't change our strategy towards Iran. As long as they'll be able to continue to arm and fund organizations that exist for one purpose only, to kill Jews wherever they are, we will not enjoy stability and peace, and it will affect our prosperity, it will affect our economy, our ability to live and grow and prosper and do the beautiful things that we do in Israel. And on the positive side of that, if we indeed force the Iranians to change their strategy, or if we apply pressure on the Iranian regime to such an extent that they are persuaded not to continue, then we could see the reverse result of that. And a lot of it is about Israel. Yes, nothing of real big substance can happen in the Middle East without American involvement. And there's very close coordination now as we speak between the US and the Israeli military. Last time, by the way, it's something that people take for granted, but as someone who's seen military operations behind the scenes, to witness the coordination of air defenses that Israel did on the 13th and 14th of April together with its allies, it was a work of beauty. I actually didn't believe that we would be able to coordinate planes and missile interceptors from 4 different countries flying in the same airspace against a multitude of incoming threats to take down 99% of those threats without any accidents occurring. My biggest fear was that we would shoot down a British or a French or an American plane. And it's think about it, it's quite a feasible thing to happen. Lots of missiles flying in the air, planes intercepting. Sometimes mistakes happen, but they didn't happen. And that's a testament to the level of coordination and preparations that were at hand. And of course, as an Israeli, to Americans, ever an opportunity to express our gratitude for that. Never miss an opportunity to say thank you to the US for supporting Israel. For those of you who have been active with AIPAC and other strong lobbying organizations, then kol hakavod to you. You do a great lot of good for America and for Israel. Before we go into questions, I would just make one last remark, which I said also yesterday at the town square, and that's mostly related to you guys. So I've been, as I said, traveling around a lot. I've met lots of Jews in different communities, in Canada, in the US, almost all of the major cities, and some of the smaller ones. I've been to the UK, to Scandinavia, my native Sweden. I had to walk around with close protection when I was there with the security guards, and France and Germany as well. I am worried looking at how the other side, how our enemies and their collaborators and their supporters and their useful idiots and their crowds for rent are taking over the public domain. And I'm worried to see, not you in this room, but I'm worried to see Jews and friends of Jews that are afraid to stand up and to push back and to fight in every way that they can against those people. I know from personal experience, having grown up as a Jew in Sweden, had a great childhood, but also some anti-Semitic incidents. In my time, it was less Muslims because immigration wasn't as rampant as it is today. It was mostly old school, what we call neo-Nazis, skinheads and neo-Nazis. And there were occasional Palestinians and Lebanese. But I speak from experience, and I know what people are going through. And my message is that, first of all, whether people want it or not, I think this is going to go on for a while, and Jewish communities have to brace themselves for a long haul. This isn't going away. As I've just told you in detail about the military challenges that we face, none of those bad guys are going to be convinced that fighting Israel is an exercise in futility, and let's stop and focus on prosperity and building our own country. That's not what they do. So this is going to go on for a while, and I think that there's a direct link between what happens in Israel and around Israel and what Jews and Jewish communities around the world suffer from. And if communities, people, individuals, and organizations don't toughen up and fight back and take a strong stand, then I think that the future will be a negative one, a bleak one. And I've been saying this in various communities. I've visited some communities that were really embattled and really in a siege mentality, where they wouldn't be able to do a meeting like this without having 20 or 30 armed guards and police officers. That's in Europe. I won't say which because I'm being filmed. But other communities, and I've seen, that we did a pro-Israel rally in Times Square last week, where for every one pro-Israeli attendee, there were 4 or 5 pro-Palestinians. And that's New York, one of the biggest centers of Jewish population in the world. So my message is that just like Israelis are fighting, reservists, regular mothers are supporting their husbands and children and grandfathers and grandparents, etc. Practically whole Israel is mobilized, and we understand that this is what needs to be done. So do Jews around the world need to understand, and sadly it has become totally okay to be openly anti-Semitic and to hate Jews and to call for the death of Jews. And you've seen that and felt that. And that needs to be fought. That needs to be met with strength, with resolve, just as Israel is facing significant, difficult odds, military odds around us. We're not backing down, and we're not going to stop fighting to live peacefully in our ancestral homeland. And I think that the same equivalence could be made to you as well. Let's do a few questions. You'll pick your questions.
Yeah. So, just going to get to some more. Everybody can see why we brought Jonathan here. Our goal, short questions, detailed answers. Okay, over there, I'm going to go there, back and forth.
What's the role of the aircraft carrier, I guess Teddy Roosevelt, that we sent, a specific military role? And also, I guess we sent a squadron of F-22s, which is a pretty big deal. Hasn't happened before, I don't think. How does that, from a military point of view, for a non-military person, what does that really mean?
I would say that it means a show of seriousness of intent, and to match intent with capabilities, and to signal what I think that the US wants to achieve is to prevent Iran from entering the conflict directly and escalating it beyond Israel-Hezbollah. That I think that is what the US wants to achieve. What Israel sees is direct support and that we have someone in our corner. What Hezbollah sees is a threat, a significant, potent military threat that I'm not sure that they thought before October 7, October 8, when they started firing, and then when the president ordered 2 battle groups eventually to deploy in the Eastern Mediterranean. I think that's something that surprised both the Iranians and Hezbollah, and it carries substantial weight. It's very important. As an Israeli, I hope that of course that our soldiers won't have to fight and be wounded or killed, but I'm not naive. But I definitely hope that no other countries will have to have women or men in harm's way. And I hope that it will be enough just to be there, be present, and to show capabilities, and if necessary, something from afar. And I hope it doesn't escalate further than that, but I think the military intent is to deter and prevent a larger scale escalation.
Karen.
So given what you described about Iran's 30-year strategy, that it's executed so successfully, and what seems to be from your words, I'm inferring almost the inevitability of the war with Hezbollah. Isn't this the moment then to cut off the head of the snake and to go straight for Iran? And why would that be any worse? You just said that America's trying to not involve Iran directly and hope that Iran will stay out of it directly. It seems to me that that's the wrong strategy, that the right strategy would be to go for the nuclear power that they're trying to develop and for regime change in Iran, like now's the chance.
So I agree with you that that is definitely something that Israel should aspire to. In my mind, the question is more a question of timing, of political availability and political conditions and diplomatic situation, which I think now is maybe not the best. And maybe there will be better times from an Israeli perspective to do it, maybe. But at the end of the day, I think that, addressing an enemy as cunning, strategic, and patient as Iran has to be done the same way that they are dealing with us. So it has to be a strategy that incorporates diplomatic, economic, military, and political. And if it's only Israel lashing out and striking a bunch of sides, I don't know how successful that will be in achieving the strategic aim. And I also think that it would be much wiser for Israel not to go at such an endeavor from the current political situation that it is in. But I have no doubt, and that's why I say, for us to have stability and quiet and better conditions for prosperity and to go on to do beautiful things and have our best and brightest deal in high-tech and engineering and medical and environmental and not war and war and war, then we need to deal with Iran. And either regime change or something that will temper their will to continue to attack us and to understand that there is a price to be paid for indirectly trying to kill Jews.
Go to the far left, but that's not a political statement. Okay.
Can you comment a little bit on your view of the importance of the Saudis? Do you view the Saudis as sort of the fulcrum in this conflict or situation broadly, and their role, and the role you'd like to see them play in the rebuild ultimately of Gaza?
I had a very interesting conversation a day ago where I learned new things. And I'll put it like this. I think that the Saudis have a very potentially positive role to play, which I think that they are eager to do. I think that from their perspective, obtaining ceasefire, no fighting, peace, whatever we want to call it, but no fighting in Israel and Gaza and Hezbollah is something that works really well with their multi-year strategy, their national economic strategy, which they are committed to. And they have a very big interest in that happening. I think that they also have the ability and the financial, obviously, ability, but also now the political maturity to be brave enough to make the difficult cut and to say, we will go ahead and do positive things with Israel because it serves our national interests, and we will do it while knowing that there won't be a Palestinian state. And up until now, this has been the bottleneck, right? This has been the Rubicon that has been difficult for them to cross. And I think that after the Abraham Accords were forged, one thing that Hamas definitely did on October the 7th was to rock that boat and delay positive developments in the Middle East with Saudi and Israel. But I am hopeful, very hopeful, and I think that there's great potential there with Gulf states like the Emirates, who have a very positive posture. I was there a few weeks ago and had interesting meetings with senior officials, heard lots of positive things. They're basically just waiting or trying to bring about an end to the fighting so that they can start pumping energy and resources into the day after in a positive way, which is good. And I think that the Saudis will be able to have a good effect as well. What we need, what Israel needs, is the political leadership that has the vision and credibility and willingness to do so. And what we also need is American leadership to say, this is on us, you are part of our team, and I'm now going to make sure that our team is in order, and this is in our interest for there to be two strong allies of the US that will be cooperating together, furthering their interests and furthering American interests. And if we don't have one of the three, then it's a triangle that won't be complete, so we need to have all of the three.
All right, I'm gonna start sweeping, I don't see anything on my far right. I'll go to the young lady over there.
Hi, I am not a Palestinian or Israeli, just someone that wants to learn, so I appreciate everyone being open and kind today to that commitment. I was wondering, there's this sentiment with friendships and my community here that if someone's mourning one's loss, that ultimately elicits anger on the other side rather than maybe potential for connection, that there's a shared loss. So I was wondering if you could connect or speak to why that happens.
I didn't really understand. Could you rephrase it a little bit so I can understand?
I was standing outside and because I was also interested in hearing their
Yes.
perspectives. Thank you. I was sitting outside also wanting to learn about their perspective because I want to hear both sides. And so I was wondering, someone yelled like free the hostages, and I was wondering why, I think both sides too, seen in New York and the encampments and everything, that there is this agenda on both sides that if someone is, feeling lost for their people, why is it not rather a moment for connection rather than anger?
Okay, thanks. Me personally, I consider myself, I did serve 24 years in the military, and granted that affects my thinking and my worldview, but I don't think of myself as a person who looks at problems only with the hammer in hand and every problem is a nail. I look at my neighbors with a hope of one day living in peace with the Palestinians. I definitely am capable of feeling compassion. Israelis are capable of being very compassionate to Palestinians, and I'm sure that there are also Palestinians that are not as outspoken, but there are Palestinians that I'm sure are compassionate to Jews as well. Tell you a sad story, and it's not cynical, but I'll give you a sad example. There's a kibbutz called Nir Oz. It's a small kibbutz outside of the Gaza Strip in Israel, and it had a population of about 400 people. Nir Oz was one of the kibbutzim that was hit the hardest, the worst, on October the 7th, and basically Hamas had 12 hours of uninterrupted time to do whatever they wanted in the kibbutz. And 1 out of 4 kibbutz members was either murdered or taken hostage or wounded. And it's the worst ratio of any of the kibbutzim. There were bigger numbers in other kibbutzim, but this kibbutz was hit really hard. So I visited there 2 months after October the 7th, and I brought a group of American academics, think tanks, and we toured around, and we had a tour with one of the survivors, one of the kibbutz members, who showed us around and the burnt houses, and he told us that this is the house of the Bivas family, the redhead children, the baby, and the 5-year-old. By the way, we commemorate his 5th birthday in captivity today. yesterday in Israel. And this was their house, and this was a house of another family who were abducted, etc., etc. So a very horrible thing to see. Then we went on, and we went to the kibbutz dining hall. Kibbutz, they have a communal dining hall where they all eat together, and it's also where they have their billboard, or where they put announcements, community announcements, etc. And what caught my eye was an announcement that was in 3 A4 pages that Saturday evening of the 7th of October, we are going on a peace demonstration. There have been 3 buses chartered, and we are all going to Jerusalem to demonstrate outside of the Knesset and to call for peace and to end the conflict between us and the Palestinians. These were the people of Nir Oz. Those were their plans for the evening of Saturday. Of course, that never happened because Hamas attacked 6:30, and most of the people were either killed or taken hostage or evacuated. I give you that example, and I could give you many, many more examples of Israelis that were active, that were peace activists, who really felt compassion towards Palestinians, who were spending their private time driving Palestinian kids from Gaza into Israeli hospitals or Palestinian hospitals or American hospitals to get life-saving aid. And they did it out of a very strong belief that they were doing the right thing and that they were building the bridge for peace. The fate of these people were that they were murdered just like every other Israeli. It didn't matter for Hamas who it was, what their political beliefs were, and what their plans were for Saturday night, if they were going to a peace rally or not. And I say that because it saddens me when I think how long we have to go in the region before, think about the amount of Arabs and Muslims who after October the 7th said, this does not represent me. There weren't many. There are many, many Muslims in the world, and there are many important Arabs in the world, people of influence and power. Why didn't they speak up? On October 7th, I saw more Arab and Muslim influencers and people of importance that were gloating and happy and celebrating than I saw Muslims who live in the US or Canada or Europe who say, this doesn't represent me. This barbarism isn't my religion. It's not my faith. It's not what I believe in. And I don't want to paint all Muslims with a broad stroke, a broad black stroke. I don't think that's true. But what I think will need to happen is for much more time to go by before they will be able to feel the same level of compassion and be brave enough to extend a hand for peace that Israel has done already 4 times. And I'm not saying that Israel is perfect. We have our share of people that are not promoting peace and stability. But when I compare between the sides, there's a lot of work that needs to be done within the Arab world and with Palestinians for there to be genuine compassion and for there to be a genuine foundation for a better future.
Gordon, I'm sorry, I'm gonna work my way, I'll get everybody, I promise.
It's generally believed that Iran is within a few weeks of having a small number of crude nuclear devices, albeit with uncertain delivery capability. Israel certainly has the capability to strike. Iran has demonstrated that repeatedly, but digging out deeply buried underground facilities is a more severe challenge. And I have very little confidence in the ability, or at least the willingness of the United States to do so. Comment, sir?
Let's do a quick bottom line answer. I agree that yes, Israel has a certain capacity to strike. The problem is, and this is without going into confidential things, the problem is that even if Israel does a very successful strike against the most important Iranian nuclear sites, let's say that there are 5 really key installations, they're hardened, they're difficult to get to, layers of air defenses, many, many dozens of feet of concrete and hard rock, but let's say that Israel manages and we strike those facilities and we reduce them all to, we take them out of commission. at best, that puts the Iranians back a few years. That is not a Osirak, the nuclear reactor in Iraq in 1981 that Israel struck, or Deir Azur, the Syrian nuclear reactor in 2007. I think the military capacity is very important to have, and there needs to be a credible military threat. But since the Iranians have gone so far, and as you say correctly, sir, in terms of the fissile material that they have, and probably the technology that they have, we don't know, but we can assume that there are serious engineers hard at work for many years, and they have made quite significant advances in terms of mechanism and delivery. It's fair to assume that they have achieved those capabilities. The problem is that even if we strike, the knowledge is still there. And therefore, this goes back to what I said before of the need for a totally different Israeli strategy towards Iran, which also challenges the regime. Because if the regime goes, that's a big change for the Middle East, and it's a big change for Israel. That isn't something that I think Israel can be tackling by itself, alone. And I think Israel is very much aware of its size and scope and capabilities. Iran is a country, the Islamic Republic of Iran, I think there are about 80, 81 million. We're 10 million. Yes, we are resourceful and cunning, but there are limitations to Israel's capabilities, and that is not something that I think we can go about ourselves.
I'm going to take a question from this, two questions from this side, I'll come back. Yes, sir.
I'm just wondering, wouldn't there be an opportunity for Israel to achieve regime change in Iran by fomenting Hamas internally? I mean, obviously, Iranian society is very divided. Arguably, if the Iranians could vote, they'd kick the mullahs out anyway. So why can't you organize and arm factions within Iran to achieve regime change? That would be much more effective than a frontal military assault.
In short, I think Israel needs to.
Okay.
And if we look at Iranian history, there were two civilian uprisings by very brave Iranians in 2016 and a year-ish ago, 2022-23. They were both organic. They were both made by Iranians who were trying to stand up against the regime. They reflected the discontent and the frustration of large parts of the Iranian population. But both of them failed. They failed because the security forces, the regime, were eventually able to jail, kill, torture, or otherwise silence the people. They also failed because they didn't have any external help. And I definitely agree that there is significant value. You know, the organization in Iran that is tasked with two very important roles, the most important roles are the Revolutionary Guard. So it's an organization that is separate from the chain of command, separate from the military, navy, and air force. It has its own military, army, navy, and air force, its own budget. They answer only to the supreme leader, and they are by far the best equipped. They have two tasks. One, to safeguard the regime, and two, to export what they call to export a revolution, basically to conduct expeditionary operations abroad, to build Hezbollah, and Hamas, and Islamic Jihad, and the Houthis, etc. Today, this organization, I think, plays 70 or 80% offense and only 20% defense. And I think it is Israel's interest, the US interest, Europe's interest, if they can grow a spine and actually do something, to actually force that ratio to change. And for it to be 70 or 80% defense, as in dealing with uprisings here and instability there, and challenges to the regime, and leaders being assassinated, and many other things that can happen in a dictatorship, which are troublesome for a dictatorship. And that there's definitely an interest in that happening, instead of them having the ability, leisure, and time to continue to export instability and violence.
We'll do another question.
I hope that governments will stop doing that.
I'm gonna do two more questions this side, and I'm gonna come back. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I was hoping you could speak to realistically what you think the fate of the hostages is, and, you know, if there's any hope on either rescues or releases for them. And to that end, like, sort of building on that question, like, where is the outrage of the world for what happened to the hostages? And how is it that, like, Israel's PR compared to the Muslim Arab world's PR is so, I know there's so few of us in comparison, but still, it's mind-boggling to me how much we have to defend ourselves, given that Hamas is hiding amongst civilians and all of their complete inhumane actions. And they're not even viewed as terrorists by the majority of the world.
So 3 big questions into one.
I know.
And I'll start with the saddest part. We have 115 hostages left. The assessments that I've heard from Israeli officials, the more positive assessments speak about 50 that are alive, and then there are more pessimistic assessments that have that number lower. Israel has been trying for 8.5 months to bring about the second deal, and Hamas understands very clearly that the hostages are their last way out, and it's probably going to be, if it is, the only thing that will save Sinwar from a certain death and Hamas from total destruction. That is how they're using the hostages. I wish I believed differently, but I've been saying this for 6-7 months, basically since the first deal was ruptured by Hamas. We got a lot of the hostages back, more than 100, but then there were 2 more days when they were supposed to release the young women, and then they stopped. They didn't release the young women, not civilians and not soldiers. And since then, what I've said and believed is that I remain very pessimistic about the chances of getting them back. Because I think that Hamas doesn't want it, and that they won't agree to giving them back. The current framework is also challenging because it creates a situation where there's a very high probability that we won't get most of the men back. We'll get maybe some of the women and civilians that are left, but we won't get many of the soldiers, whether they're dead or alive, and we won't get them back. So it's very, very, extremely sad. Last week we did this rally in Times Square, and there were the parents of Omer Nutla, U.S. Israeli soldier, dual citizen, who fought on October the 7th, who was taken by Hamas, and up until today, the parents, Orna, and what's the name of the father? Orna is the mother. They have not gotten even a proof of life. And I asked them, like, about the hostage deal, etc., they said, yeah, of course we want as many as possible hostages back, but they look realistically at the chances of them having their son back, and the soldiers are like the last on the list to be released. So they're extremely sad, and I'm sadly not optimistic at all. And I hope, if I never hope I'm wrong on something, that's that one. And I hope to be surprised. Here I'll say something that, the easy way of answering your second or third question about the information war would be to blame others. Anti-Semitism and horrible Muslims and stupid people and ignorant and all of that things, which is true, but it's not what I want to answer. We have to do better. Israel has to do much, much better when it comes to communications. There has to be a strategy in place. It has to be prioritized. It has to be sanctioned from the highest level of government that this is a national priority. And when you look at how we have been communicating before and after October the 7th, That is not the case, sadly. And while I believe that we will be fighting an uphill, will be an uphill struggle anyhow, there's different ways of losing and there's different ways of behaving ourselves. And I think that much more needs to be done by the government in order to be better at our communications, and I'm very disappointed that it isn't being done. And we can blame the rest of the world, our enemies always do that, right? They always blame everybody else. We are responsible also for our fate, and we need to be much better.
I'm gonna do one more of this young lady here, and I'll come here, and then we'll see how we do, or how he's standing up. Go ahead.
My question is, after being involved in AIPAC, I know the cooperation we have between the United States and Israel. However, after seeing the fact that some of the weaponry and that had been promised to Israel has not necessarily been delivered, when this is over, Halavai, what do you think is going to happen in Israel regarding weaponry and having their own and not being as dependent on their greatest ally or anybody else for their own weapons of defense?
Why do you do
No, okay, well,
the USA?
our greatest ally, the greatest ally.
There's no doubt about it.
All right, the
There's
greatest
no doubt
ally,
about it, yes.
at times. I mean, I just feel like if you're an ally, whether you agree or you disagree, and you should always stand with your ally, and when there's problems, it's in private, not in public.
Yeah.
And so thank you. So my question, okay.
Yeah,
is-
so
yes,
what will
yes.
be afterwards?
Yes.
Okay. So what I think that, first of all, these are long-term processes, right? These are things that take a lot of time to build the industrial capabilities to produce the type of weapons and parts that we will need in order to be more independent. We will never be totally independent. Takes a lot of time, takes resources, and it needs to be defined as a priority by different governments, not just one government, but the next one and the next one. I think that it's fair to assume that we will see a move in that direction. To be really honest and tachlis, it will have a small effect, I think. And there's a very good paper written by FDD experts on this specific topic, on the military industrial base. I recommend you look it up on FDD's site. It was written by Brad Bowman and General Montgomery. So they did a good analysis of Israel's military industrial base, what Israel would need to do in order to be far less dependent on US weapons, how long it would take, and what the price would be. So it's a big deal. And I assume that Israel will make steps in that direction, but these are things, to really have an impact, we're talking about 10, 20 years, if at all. And I suppose that after this war, we will look into those directions, but I don't think that anybody in Israel, even the more reckless ministers that we have, can think that Israel would be independent and capable of fighting itself and doing whatever it wants, regardless of international diplomacy and conditions. Not gonna happen.
Right.
Thank you for this education. There was a question earlier about Iran's nuclear capabilities. What is your assessment of the likelihood that they're going to choose to break out in the near future? And if they do, how would that change your assessment of how to proceed in the Middle East?
They already have broken out. They've crossed the threshold of enough fissile material to build 15 bombs. And that's not Israeli intel, not even American intel, that's the Atomic Agency who said it 4 months ago. Iran has enough fissile material for 13 bombs. They said at the time, now it's corrected to 15. So breakout in that sense has already been achieved. Now the question is, do they have a mechanism and do they have a way to deliver missile? That's what it's about now. And these are more challenging stages because enriched material is something that you can quantify and to some extent, obviously not good enough as we see in reality, but you can to some extent monitor. Right? If you know where they're enriching, you can have inspectors there, and then you have some sense of how much they're advancing. Obviously, now they have crossed that, and one of the three basic conditions for having a nuclear bomb, they've already met those criteria. So in terms of breakout, I think it's a thing of the past, and it's not so relevant to speak about it anymore. And my assessment, based on conversations with both FDD experts and IDF and Americans, military, on their ability to achieve it, there's variations on how long it would take them. They vary from months to years, so not a good answer. But it looks as if everything indicates that they are very focused on getting there, and that they're not going to relinquish. They've gone too far and paid too much in order to stand down from their project, the nuclear project, and I think that they will continue to work for it until they achieve it or they're stopped.
And how will that achievement affect matters of Middle East?
Game changer. That will mean a nuclear umbrella above Israel's head.
So I offered Jonathan to provide him security. He turned down the 69-year-old man's security, and I know he's getting tired. So let's try to make these a couple more rapid fire calls. First you, then I'll go to you.
Jonathan, thank you. Would you comment on the complicity of Egypt with Hamas and the short-term and long-term impact of that in terms of the relationship between Israel and Egypt, please?
So the sad thing is that we will need Egypt the day after, and they will have an important role, both constructive and destructive, if they choose destructive, in securing Gaza the day after the war ends and the day after we defeat Hamas. We can hate the Egyptians, we can loathe them, we can despise them for their complicity in helping Hamas, for the fact that they knowingly allowed unlimited movement of arms through Sinai into Gaza. We can be angry at them for not taking care of the tunnels, and we can be very frustrated with the fact that they didn't help Israel evacuate Gazans out of Gaza so that we could fight a quick and fierce war against Hamas without civilians there, which is what Israel asked in the beginning. So all of these things are negative things. I personally think that we have been too soft on Egypt. We have not used our ability to leverage, to apply pressure on the Egyptian regime. We have been very good peace partners and supported their security needs when they needed it, and done it very well. But we have sold ourselves cheap, and we haven't demanded that they stop facilitating the weaponization of our enemies. Having said all that, we still will have to work with Egypt the day after. So we cannot burn a bridge with them. If what I think is that we should do a hard reset of our dealings with Egypt, take a long, hard assessment of how complicit they have been with Hamas and how cynical their policies have been towards Israel, and to act in the same way. If it means lobbying in the U.S. to condition the very generous American military aid that is provided to Egypt, why not? If it means doing other things that makes life less comfortable for that dictatorship, then why not? And I think that we have been way too soft on the Egyptians, and it has cost us a lot of lives.
We are getting really close to an end. The young lady in the blue standing there. I'll get around, but very quick, and I'll say that to my speaker too.
Yeah.
Very quick answer.
Yeah.
It's really taught us a lot. I'm happy you talked about the need for American Jews to accept the new reality we live in, and that we have to step up. Here in Jackson, my doctor confided
Speak
to
up.
me that a Yale law student who is here on a rotation refused to see a Jewish patient because she said we're oppressors, and absolutely nothing happened to her. What is your advice on what we do when we hear about incidents like that?
I had a fascinating dinner meeting with an Iranian dissident, a very brave woman called Masih Alinejad. I hope I pronounced her name correctly. Does anybody know her? No? For ladies on Instagram, she is phenomenon on Instagram. She's big on X as well. But she is this Iranian lady who was forced out of Iran because she basically was espousing women's rights, human rights, and her big thing was, I want to feel the wind in my hair. And she's on with that, and if you look her up on social media, she's phenomenal. And another thing that she's been doing is telling Iranians, my camera is my weapon. And I use that example because I think too many people get away with doing horrible, shameful things without it being documented and without being confronted by people, because it's inconvenient and it's, you know, people might feel that they're combative and confrontational if they pull out the camera. But in an instance like this, I would say your camera is your weapon and that person should be shamed. Just like the heads of universities were shamed in the public square for their lack of defense of Jews on campus and the fact that they're not doing their job. Anybody who does such an awful thing should be shamed. So the thinking is to be more combative, and in such an instance, out goes the camera, tell me why you're not going to treat me, and why do you do that, and have that out on social media. It's very effective.
All right, gentleman over here, young lady over there, and that gentleman here. That's, I'm gonna get it right, said the gentleman in the white hat first.
Comment to the fellow who,
Speak up, loud.
a quick comment in response to the fellow who talked about Iran. Just go ask Muammar Gaddafi what happens when you give up your nuclear weapons. It's just not going to happen. My question to you, sir, is if you found out that the hostages were dead,
Yeah.
which is probably close to the truth, how would that change the strategic military strategy employed in Gaza?
What it would probably do would be to unleash much more firepower and kinetics. It would probably unleash the Mossad in Qatar and other places against senior Hamas members. And it would probably allow Israel to be more kinetic and to use more force in order to get the job done against Hamas. And I think that the hostages have been used very effectively by Hamas in that sense.
All right, yes ma'am, in the white, and then that gentleman, and we're gonna stop at this point because this has become a marathon for the young man here.
Two quick questions that can be answered yes or no. You may or may not want to do. Can there be peace with Bibi Netanyahu as the head of Israel? Number one.
Define
Number
peace.
two,
Define peace.
Can the Sunni?
No, define peace. You say can there be
a-
peace? Define
the end
peace.
of the- All right, the end of cessations, return of the hostages, and Hamas standing down or destroyed. Can it happen if Bibi is the head of Israel? Number one. Number, defined as I just did. And number two, just for the day after, there are some people thinking about what this is. What is the probability that Egypt and the Sunni alliance of the Abraham Accords will contribute to an international peacekeeping force in a disarmed Gaza? Because it seems to me that your sad projection that your wife, that your youngest son might end up going to Gaza is a terrible thing to think about. And what I'd rather think of that is the prospect for international peacekeeping from the Arab states, because as you know very well, the whole creation of Arab refugees was a byproduct of the way Israel was set up and a reflection of the refusal of Egypt and Jordan and all the neighboring states to take in Palestinians at the time. So now you have Sinwar, who was born in
So wait, hold that to that. Okay.
So since you defined peace as you did, which isn't probably my definition of peace, but let's say since you defined it that way, then my short answer would be yes, possible. The first question. And the second question, peacekeeping in the sense of them sending soldiers that would be subject to a still existing Hamas that would be able to fire anti-tank missiles and RPGs and IEDs and make life difficult and dangerous for them, less likely. willingness to send money and political diplomatic cover and partnership, likely. I don't see anybody else but Israel controlling Gaza for quite a few years to come. If we would have Jordanians, Saudis not likely, but Moroccans, Egyptians willing to be there, I think that the condition for them to come would be that it would be a totally safe environment with a non-existent Hamas, because the moment that they start blowing up on IDs, they do what peacekeeping forces do, they disintegrate.
One last question. Yes.
I heard a report recently that there were some Chinese nationals or military personnel were found in the tunnels in Gaza, and that there was contribution to the engineering and development of those tunnels from the Chinese. Is there any truth to that? And if so, how does that play into this?
Yeah. Hamas has had assistance that we know in Israel based on intel and interrogations, etc. They've had assistance, a lot of assistance from Hezbollah, who taught them the early stages of the whole strategy, the tunnels, and the logistics of it, and Hezbollah have a lot of experience. And they had certain North Korean assistance, especially for the bigger smuggling tunnels that we are now uncovering in Rafah. I am not aware of anything Chinese. Maybe North Koreans were confused as Chinese. I don't know. Could be, I don't know. No, I'm not making light of it. But, I'm not aware of any Chinese direct involvement. It would be a very odd thing for the Chinese to stretch their neck in such a way. But the North Koreans have been helping Hezbollah and helping Hamas.
I think everyone can see why the Jacksonville Jewish community felt it so important to bring down.